We would like to thank everybody for being with us today. This is Annie Kennedy with Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. And we'd also like to thank Tim Franson, who's the Chief Medical Officer for YourEncore and has been a longtime consultant and friend to PPMD, and Dave Zook, who is with FaegreBD Consulting, and again, a longtime friend and consultant to PPMD, for joining us today. First, we'd like to start with, I think it's appropriate to just take a moment and say, wow, and recognize that after decades of investment and preparation and cautious optimism and anticipation of this moment, we are officially in the post-approval space for the Duchenne community. And specific to this topic, preparing for access to approved therapies, PPMD has been working in an anticipatory way for this moment for a little over 2 years. And so this is quite a moment. This is the turning of a page in our Duchenne community story. And so I think we should just pause for a second and realize that this is a big deal, and we're very grateful to all the clinicians, researchers, scientists, partners, but most especially to the families who in all ways made this moment possible. So today's webinar is for all members of our community. And if I can get to the next slide. I think I lost my toggling ability, so if somebody can forward that for me. As we like to say at PPMD, for every single one. And the reason for that being that if you look at at Duchenne, as everyone probably on this call knows, this is a multi-systemic disorder. And researchers and companies are working to develop effective therapies to address all of these pathways. And so this is our Duchenne pipeline. This is currently our Duchenne pipeline. And 2 years ago, as our pipeline was shifting further and further to the right, meaning that more and more trials were making it into phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, and we were entering really intense FDA engagement around product review, we really began to also engage in this value and access environment and ecosystem. And so whether today you're on the call because you're amenable to an exon 51 skip, or because there is another aspect of this pipeline that is more relevant and more meaningful to you, this webinar and the work that we've been doing around access is for you. And there truly is something in this pipeline for 100% of our Duchenne community, which is really what makes this moment for our community extraordinary. So, today is the first webinar of a series of webinars around access that PPMD is going to be hosting. Our future webinars will include partners from other communities, such as rare disease communities, other access communities, and collaborators that we've been engaging with over the last 2 years. And we want to continue to hear from you to inform the content of these webinars. Today's has been largely informed from questions that we've been receiving over the last 2 weeks and some of the preparations that we've been doing to get to last Monday. Today's webinar will be archived, and we will post it later today or tomorrow. And what we hope that you take away from today is information about how to know what approved or emerging Duchenne therapies you or your loved one will be eligible for, concrete items to discuss with your physician as you prepare for access to these therapies, items to query your health insurer to better understand your policy in the context of the benefits you may soon be seeking. We know that people in our community are really terrific health advocates, and for many in our community are really great at navigating DME benefits, but this new world of specialty pharmacies, medical benefits, and pharmaceutical benefits will be new to many. A sense of the timelines that may be involved and why, support resources, so where to turn to when you hit a barrier or you have questions, and an understanding of how PPMD has been and will continue to engage in this larger environment, and how we really need our community to be leaning in with us as we engage. So I hope most people on this call are aware of Duchenne, but as you listen today, I think it's really critical for everyone to understand and be aware of you or your child's eligibility for the ongoing trials and emerging therapies. And so this resource, Decode Duchenne, was put together several years ago by PPMD and our partners, and we're very grateful to PTC, Sarepta, and BioMarin for supporting this resource for the community. And we partnered with these companies to remove the access barrier to genetic testing. So there are many in our community for whom your test results or your diagnosis of Duchenne came through a muscle biopsy, or you live in a state where your insurer is Medicaid and they won't pay for genetic testing, or there are other financial barriers that do not allow you to have access to genetic testing, and we wanted to remove that barrier. So it's critical that people understand your diagnosis and have a confirmed genotypical diagnosis of Duchenne. So that's what Decode Duchenne is all about. At PPMD, we have 4 genetic counselors on staff at PPMD, and at no cost to anyone in our community, you have access to those individuals. So we ask that if you have any questions about which trials and which emerging therapies you may be eligible for, that you reach out to our genetic counseling team and that you inquire about these services. And so here's the information, and again, we will post this at the end of this webinar. Another really extraordinary and important resource are the Certified Duchenne Care Centers, and that, again, is a program supported by PPMD. And these are teams of providers who are unbelievably committed to Duchenne care. And each of these centers has a care coordinator or clinical center coordinator, and then also have teams of providers who are very well versed in these therapies, again, that are coming through the clinical trials. Many of them are running these clinical trials. So we encourage you to be having discussions with your providers around what you're interested in participating in. If you have questions about the approval last week, around whether or not you have your most current information and medical records, so that you have that at the ready. And if you don't live near one of the certified Duchenne care centers or are not able to travel to one, of course there are neuromuscular care centers throughout the U.S. that also have amazing clinicians, and we just want you to be in touch with folks and have your information available to you. But the more that you understand about your insurance and therapy eligibility, the better equipped you are to be the quarterback of your medical team and navigate these complex systems. So then on Monday, we also hosted a webinar with Sarepta about the program that was launched last week at the announcement of the approval of Exondys 51 called Sarepta Cyst. So this is a program specifically for those who are amenable to the exon 51 skip product, Exondys 51, which is our first approved product for Duchenne. And if you are eligible for this product, or you have questions about whether you are, this is the information for how you can begin the pathway to accessing that product. We also are posting that webinar, and it will be posted by the end of the day tomorrow, so that you can hear more details about how access will be achieved through that product. Okay, so I'm going to intro Tim and turn this over to Tim Franson. Before we dive fully into the access issues today, we have had a lot of questions come in around Exondys 51, what exactly accelerated approval means in terms of our patient community, and then questions around the post-market commitments that are now required of Sarepta. And we're going to take a few minutes to address as much of that as we can. We do want to certainly remind people that a lot of this will still need to be worked out by Sarepta in the coming days and weeks. But we are going to try and explain some of this in the context of what the regulatory requirements now are, and we've asked Tim Franson to help provide some insight to that. So Tim, I'm going to turn this over to you, and I will toggle your slides for you when you ask me to forward them.
That's great. Thank you very much, Annie, and really delighted to be here in another step in a very important pathway for the community. And in the spirit of being in an Olympic year, I'd like us to think of drug development and approval and then access as a series of hurdles in a relay race, and that there are key handoffs and many important participants. And the community now has a gold medal for a variety of reasons. First, because of the tremendous commitment and trial involvement, not only with this compound, but in others. Second, the community's engagement in the patient preference studies and benefit risk. And those all led up to the important features of FDA's review and approval of this application. I will be discussing that point, and I will do that very briefly, and then we'll get on to the important consideration by my friend and colleague Dave Zook about the actual elements of access. But until there's FDA approval, no access is possible, of course, or on a limited basis only. So, Annie, if I could have the slide that's headed overview of expedited programs.
Perfect.
There are actually, thank you. There are several programs, and one can actually be awarded one or more of these. Accepting fast track and breakthrough are very similar, so you'll only get one of those. We're going to be talking about accelerated approval, which is something that goes beyond the initial approval process. And there is a guidance that covers all of these expedited programs. I won't go into all the details, but there are some very specific qualifying criteria and some things that go with each set. So on the next slide, it just talks a little bit about accelerated approval pathway. For those who are attorneys and I know there are several in the community that we work with closely and would love to read some of those regulations. Good luck not falling asleep, but there are some very explicit reference points. But there were no guidance for accelerated approval, which was created in 1997 until the 2013 expedited programs draft, and that was because of legislation that was passed in 2012. And the two things important to the patient community are that legislation took accelerated approval to a new level of flexibility and clarity. Flexibility meaning that FDA could exercise more latitude in the kinds of evidence that was necessary for qualifications and taking into account the available alternative treatments. And then in clarity, providing a much greater breadth of things that could be looked at in a clinical trial as an endpoint, short of survival or something that was irreversible morbidity or things that just won't reverse in a condition. Obviously, you'd like to detect progress with the drug before that. So on the next slide, it talks about the accelerated approval path. One second, and it talks about some of the criteria. It's very serious.
Hey, Tim, you're breaking up just a little bit.
Okay, my apology. Thanks for telling me, Annie. So accelerated approval pathway involves a demonstration of effect that is not survival, but something on the pathway to irreversible damage in certain functions or survival. The two big things that we have talked about in prior webinars for PPMD, a surrogate endpoint like a biomarker, which is very important here when we talk about dystrophin, and then intermediate clinical endpoints, which can qualify as something along the pathway to survival. And these are based on what FDA terms an effect, not a final benefit. So just to briefly talk about something that is an intermediate clinical endpoint or a biomarker, these are things where it's a modest clinical benefit that probably on its own would not qualify for full approval, but it's a strong indicator that the drug appears to have effect and that it gives one hope that additional studies can confirm that. So demonstrating a clinical benefit in these ways that is reasonably likely to predict an effect on the ultimate outcomes with the disease is very important. And that's part of the qualification for the accelerated approval pathway. So if you could just move to that slide on conditions of approval. Once one is qualified an intermediate clinical endpoint or biomarker as an indicator of activity, Then there are conditions of approval. You have to complete a series of post-approval trials to really prove that the ultimate endpoint of survival or improved functional aspects are what the initial tests indicated they would be. And then there are some limitations on how a company can share promotional material. They have to have that pre-cleared by the FDA. And when one is approved under accelerated approval, that's the good news. The not so good news is if the confirmatory studies do not show or confirm the effect, then the drug may be subjected to expedited withdrawal or removal from the marketplace. That has occurred, so it's more than a theoretical risk. And to go to my final point here on accelerated approval in looking at other considerations for this specific product, and I'm not a product consultant for this company or any others in this area. We've worked exclusively with PPMD in the interest of all the patients for any and all possible therapies going forward. And this first one is a great springboard to the next. FDA did not restrict access, as is sometimes the case with accelerated approval. There are potential for restrictions in healthcare programs depending on how those hospital formularies or their lists of approved drugs or clinic-approved drugs might be. And the label that FDA gave to eteplirsen was for indication for use in exon 51 amenable patients only. And their specific letter, in terms of the thing I already referred to about post-approval studies, they are obliged to do a number of things, and I've just highlighted several. One is a 2-year randomized, double-blinded controlled trial to be completed by 2020, and the letter, which is publicly available for any of you to see on drugs@fda.com, lists some intermediate points of when the protocol needs to be finalized and so forth. There needs to be several animal studies on carcinogenicity or risk of producing tumors or not. There are studies to be completed on immune response by patients, that is, when patients receive eteplirsen over a prolonged period, will it lead to any antibody promotion or other things that might lead to immune side effects, some manufacturing data, and then a commitment to study exon 45 and 53 patients. So actually pretty encouraging overall, and we've certainly seen a number of episodes of accelerated approval where indeed the evidence has been confirmed, and then that usually transitions to a full approval process, and sometimes in those cases, expanded access. So, Annie, why don't I stop there? Well, and if you have any questions.
I do have a couple questions for you. So that was terrific. Thank you, Tim. And that's a lot of great information. So thank you. I just want to ask just a couple follow-up questions and maybe just underscore a couple things on this slide in particular. So when we talk about access not restricted, there's no restricted distribution by FDA. So just to emphasize that it still means that you have to be amenable to an exon 51 skip for this product, correct? But that means that there's no age or gender restriction on the label.
That is correct, Annie. There was no age limitations stated there. How healthcare plans interpret those things is open to speculation, but usually folks respect the label as written, and this was fairly broadly written, so no gender restriction either.
Great, and that would be in keeping with the guidance work that we had done and what FDA had indicated that they would accept. So that's terrific news for our community. And then just a question about the post-approval commitments, and again, you know, certainly understanding that we are not Sarepta and we certainly can't know what Sarepta is planning to do, but just a question around precedent, perhaps. When FDA asks for a 2-year randomized double-blind controlled trial, is there a requirement that the trial be conducted in the U.S., or could that be conducted outside the U.S. and then that data used to satisfy that post-approval commitment?
It's a great question, Annie. and there's nothing specifically stated about having U.S.-only trial. It would be unusual for a company to have 0 U.S. patients, but one would anticipate that in most situations of this nature, you'd like to enroll folks as fast as possible, so on a global basis is usually the most rational thing. I don't know what the company would plan, but that would be a reasonable supposition.
Okay. And then just another question. We often will work closely with a lot of other partners and other communities, and we look to those communities as examples and look for their best practices. Can you think of another example of another community that received an approval through an accelerated approval? And if there are any learnings or similarities you can think of that we could look to as an example in this situation?
Really interesting perspectives on that. Both best case and worst case type situations. On the best case side, there's some wonderful examples in oncology where by facilitating the enrollment of these confirmatory studies, folks were able to finish ahead of schedule, get full approval, and that tended to really reassure a lot of the parties who are doing reimbursement or other deliberations. The same thing can be said on the flip side, how to learn about slow enrollment and what's happened in several oncology trials where as a result of that and not being able to complete the studies, those products were withdrawn from the market. There are only 2 such examples of that, but it's certainly an important factor for the community to appreciate the importance of having these studies completed.
So, well, thank you. That's actually great. You know, we have talked about a lot in the last couple of weeks that really the Duchenne community has again demonstrated that we have some control over our community's destiny. And those 2 examples, it sort of just strikes me as those are 2 examples of how the community in supporting these confirmatory studies will, again, you know, we can't control what the outcome of the study will be, but in supporting enrollment, supporting the studies moving forward, we can, again, help move that forward. Great. Well, those are the questions I had for you, Tim. Thank you. And thank you. We appreciate, we know that you're traveling right now, so thank you for doing this call for us while you were in transit.
A pleasure.
So we are going to shift now to access, which is the first time we've ever, in my 20-plus years in this field, been able to go right from an approval discussion into an access discussion because it was immediately relevant to our community. So this is really a moment. And so we want to recognize that the access and health insurer landscape is a highly variable and dynamic environment, and we know that there's been a lot of media and messaging around reimbursement that's been confusing and at times worrisome. In the last couple of years in general, and then very specifically in the last couple of weeks specific to Duchenne. So today is really about equipping our community, you, with the tools needed to begin to navigate these new dimensions of your health care. So we've asked Dave Zook from FaegreBD to join us, and their team has been working with us for quite some time, and he's going to take us through this to help really begin to empower us on an individual level as healthcare consumers to understand this new access environment that we've now been thrust into. And so, Dave, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thanks very much, Annie. It's a pleasure to be with you and Tim today and the community to help begin to move through this important phase. I am reminded, you mentioned that you've been at it for a couple of years, and it certainly is, to borrow Tim's analogy to the Olympics, you know, it is a long-distance race, and we're making important progress. What we're going to talk about today in terms of insurance are just some of the hurdles ahead, and I'm convinced that the Duchenne community and its ability to work together and really get across these hurdles will be successful moving ahead. So we're going to keep this pretty high level as we prepared for this. We're thinking about specific products and how those might come to market. And Tim's comments, of course, shed some additional light on that. But we're going to keep it pretty high level at this stage and not particularly product specific, so we can begin to build that toolkit that you were talking about, Annie. So next slide, please. Of course, there are different kinds of health plans or health insurance that individuals are going to have and going to need to navigate moving ahead. And for Duchenne therapies, we're really probably going to touch on all of the major types of health plans. Private insurance, which can come through a group plan that's typically employer-sponsored, or individual plans, which you might acquire through health insurance exchanges or marketplaces, for example. Public insurance programs are very important for this community, particularly Medicaid. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail this afternoon. Medicare for a small set of folks may be involved moving ahead. We'll spend a little bit of time on that, and then folks in the military, of course, have specialized benefits and plans, insurance plans that cover them and their dependents. Today we're going to focus. Yes, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to ask Dave, for the sake of what we hear about out in the world, which of these would fall under the category of commercial insurance plans?
Okay. Commercial would typically be the private insurance companies.
Great.
So the group or the individual plans. Sometimes you'll hear that term around Medicaid managed care. Those are private companies as well that help the states run Medicaid. But for the most part, when you hear that term, that's private insurance.
Great, thanks.
So then next slide. Health insurance generally has a couple of pieces to it. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this. You have the medical benefit component, which is primarily about covering physician services, hospital expenses, and the like. Sometimes, as we'll talk about, the pharmacy or drug costs can be bundled in those services, can be part of the medical benefit. But most plans also have a drug benefit, which is specifically designed to help pay for pharmaceutical costs. So these are two big components of health plans that are important to understand as you navigate access. And just to also begin to frame things, when you take a medication, a drug orally, those are typically covered by a health plan's drug benefit. So that's the piece that you're most interested in when you're gaining access to a newly approved drug. Drugs that are delivered by injection or infusion, again, generally those are in the medical benefit, and the rationale is that they are part of a physician's services and delivered to you typically in a clinic setting or a physician's office. So those are more often, especially in commercial plans, in the medical benefit. And then self-injected drugs, just to emphasize how things are changing and some of the complexity, they actually, depending on how the plan is designed, which is true throughout, they can fall into either the medical or the drug component benefit of the health insurance plan. So not always clear, and we'll talk a little bit about why it's important to really understand your specific plan so that you can be successful in obtaining access. Next slide. So I'm sure most of you have heard that health plans are oftentimes have a lot of complexity to them, and whether in the medical benefit or the drug benefit, they can have areas where they provide coverage and reasons or what's typically called exclusions or exceptions for different kinds of services and medications. So it's very important to understand how your specific policy works, whether you're in a commercial plan or a public program like Medicaid or Medicare. And you have to understand that coverage and specifically for today's discussion, what drugs are covered and what drugs are not covered. A term that you'll hear us using today, and I think a lot moving forward, is a formulary. Tim mentioned this earlier, but this is really the list of drugs that are covered by a specific health plan and how they're covered. So the formulary is what changes when a new drug comes onto a market and a plan makes a decision about how it's going to treat that specific medication. As you can imagine, with lots of different plans and lots of different approaches, it takes some time typically for a new drug to get on that formulary or for a decision to be made about whether or not it's going to be covered and how. And that involves the company really bringing the information about the drug. Tim touched on this as well, the data that's been developed in the regulatory process, the clinical trial data, and other information that the health plan really needs to make a decision. Oftentimes, and just to continue to sort of make sure we understand terms the same way, you'll hear that the pharmacy benefit manager is very involved in the decision around the formulary and how a drug is made available to clinicians and to patients. And the pharmacy benefit manager really runs the drug plan element, the drug benefit. It's a separate company oftentimes and works with your health plan specifically to operate that piece of your health insurance coverage. We'll also talk about something called a Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee, P&T Committee usually referred to, and these are the experts that help inform the plan, help inform the PBM on the benefits and the downsides of specific medications, whether and how they should be covered, really make those key decisions and have the technical expertise, and oftentimes involve patient perspective, increasingly involve consumer and patient perspective in that. Something that I know PPMD will be focused on, as they have in the drug development space, is how to ensure that the Duchenne families have a voice in decisions about coverage. Some of that will be, I think, centered on these P&T committees and how they make their decisions about the formularies. So if we can move to the next page, please. Next slide. We want to talk for just a minute about the fact that even if the health plan has made a decision about a specific medication and that it will not be providing coverage, we're going to emphasize this for a moment. There are steps that you can take as a participant in that health plan, and this is true. There's a process in every health plan really to try to gain access, even if the initial decisions are not favorable about including a specific drug in a formulary. So you can ask your plan, and you usually work with your doctor to accomplish this. You can ask your plan for what's known as an exception to the rules that they've set for running the health insurance. And if they don't grant an exception to their current rules, they almost always have an appeals process. And this is a way for you to bring more information to the decision, a better understanding of the benefit of that therapy for your family, for your beneficiary, and why the plan should cover that. Again, working with your physician to make that request for an exception and for making an appeal is a very important collaboration. We encourage it. Next slide. So it would be great if it was as simple as it's either on the plan covered by the plan or not, but as I'm sure most people are aware, health insurance is a complex contract, and they oftentimes have different ways to manage access to therapies, what is often referred to as utilization management. You've probably heard of many of these strategies. They're oftentimes designed to help move patients to what's effective but also lower cost. It can be to ensure that there's more of a stepwise approach to the use of therapies based on best practices, a variety of reasons. But these utilization management tools are very common across all kinds of health plans. They include things such as preferred drug lists, so that as you move to different therapies, if they're more expensive or there's less data, you may have to pay more out of pocket to get access than you do for lower cost or more well understood therapies. There can be a requirement for prior authorization. In other words, the company has to grant you access before the prescription can be filled, quantity limits, and something known as step therapy, which is, as I mentioned earlier, you have to proceed through different medications before obtaining access to perhaps a new therapy. So next slide, please. In addition to the utilization management aspect of health insurance, there also is a cost component of this. Touched on this a little bit earlier, but we oftentimes see that access is very significantly impacted, of course, by the out-of-pocket costs or other limits that a health insurance plan may have on the financial contributions that they'll make towards your coverage, towards your care. Specific examples of this can include the out-of-pocket maximum, what you can spend each year on covered benefits that can be helpful, and that oftentimes is around $1,000. Again, it varies from plan to plan, but the way this works is that after you've met that amount, then the health insurance plan will start to pay more or all of the cost of access to the therapies. What we'd like to do now, I think, is turn to Medicaid. There are going to be some similar themes here, but given the fact that a very significant part of the Duchenne population actually participates in the Medicaid program as well as the SSI program, we do want to spend a little bit of time on this today and begin to set the stage for access in Medicaid. So in Medicaid, as you may know, it's a federal program, but it's operated in partnership between the federal government and the state. And the rules, for the most part, are set at the state level. So everything we're going to be talking about, you'll need to be paying attention to your state Medicaid program, if this is the form of healthcare coverage that you have. As the slide notes, you must be a resident of the state and of the U.S. or a qualified immigrant, and then meet other characteristics to participate in Medicaid, income levels, or other status to be able to get coverage through Medicaid. Very importantly, for the Duchenne community, there is a component of Medicaid known as the Katie Beckett or TEFRA waiver that was designed in the early 80s really to ensure that individuals, young people, could have, with complex chronic conditions, could have access to Medicaid and wouldn't be disqualified by virtue of their family's income. So you have this element of Medicaid, which most states have adopted at this point and make available to individuals in their community, children 18 or younger living at home, who meet the SSI definition, supplemental security income definition, but if they were to count their family's income, would not be qualified for Medicaid coverage. So with this feature of Medicaid, you're able to not include the family income, only the income of the child, which of course is typically nominal, and that gives them access to Medicaid, which can be very, very important for communities like the Duchenne community for getting access to all forms of therapies, including newly approved drugs. So on the next slide, we are going to talk a little bit about the fact that Medicaid is a fairly aggressive program for providing, at least historically, an aggressive program for providing access to new technologies and new therapies. So if it's FDA approved and your physician is using it according to the indication, that has typically been covered both in the hospital and an outpatient basis by Medicaid throughout the country. Very, very strong program for access to therapies. Some of this is changing. This is an area we'll have to watch closely, and PPMD, I know, will be working aggressively to address and to provide tools to the community because frankly, the overall cost of therapies has been rising for Medicaid programs. You've probably seen a lot of coverage in recent months around drugs for hepatitis C, Sovaldi and Horvani, for example, that presented significant cost for Medicaid-covered populations across the country. And there were efforts in a number of states to try to control those costs and to find ways to make sure that the therapies got to those most in need of them, but also tried to manage the expense or the budget component for their Medicaid programs. So next slide, please. What we've highlighted here is that those same tools that I talked about earlier in the commercial plans really are beginning to be used increasingly in Medicaid programs. So this is something we'll have to watch for in terms of the Medicaid coverage that's available for many Duchenne families, whether these new utilization management tools are being used in ways in Medicaid programs that present new barriers for our families and take steps to try to convince policymakers not to move in that direction for our population, given the intense unmet medical need that exists in Duchenne and the opportunity of these new therapies. Next slide. Much as in commercial coverage, there are opportunities if the Medicaid formulary doesn't cover a therapy that becomes available for Duchenne. Again, that's not typical, but we could, through these utilization management trends, begin to see more of this. And so we are encouraging the community to begin to be prepared for appealing and pursuing coverage across all types of programs, Medicaid, Medicare, and private insurance. Next slide. So just some of the key features of making appeals of coverage denials. We hope this won't be prevalent, but if it is, we want to make sure that PPMD is supporting you in understanding how to pursue this. One of the first things, particularly in a drug denial, is understanding, of course, your plan rules, and then what is the basis for the denial? What element of those plan rules is really coming into play? Is it medical necessity, or is it another feature of the plan? And then based upon what is driving that decision, then you'll have to form an argument, an appeal to the plan, whether commercial or Medicaid or a public plan, to reverse that decision. It's important, again, as I've mentioned, to work closely with your physician. They have a great deal of influence in this process for understanding the medical necessity and the opportunities that the therapy offers to your family. So that collaboration continues to be important. There are also tools out there, consumer health assistance programs in the states that, among other things, focus on Medicaid coverage and supporting individuals that are trying to work through the appeals process. The Department of Insurance in states also typically offers that kind of support to individuals, and advocates, including Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, that will be developing and making available appeals support are important places to turn when you encounter that kind of a access challenge.
Great. Thanks, Dave. I do want to just remind people also that that each of the individual companies and sponsors that are developing programs also will have patient assistance programs, and we didn't go into the details around that because this is intended to be a more general presentation around access. But, for example, we referred earlier to the Sarepta Cyst program, and again, there was a very detailed webinar on Monday that we encourage you to go back and listen to if you're interested in more details about either that program or programs like that, where if you are having trouble accessing a therapy that you are eligible for, these companies that we're working with, and Sarepta is a great example, Marathon is coming soon behind, PTC, also have plans in place to work in a very committed way to ensure access for our patient community. So, and we do want to let people know that what we're outlining are the mechanisms to appeal through your insurer, but also the companies that are working to develop products are very committed to our Duchenne community and access for our community, and we'll have patient assistance programs in place also, and case managers who can work with you on access to those products. So just want to make sure everybody also is aware of that. Okay, so then for resources, we have a resource page on PPMD's site, and we are building out we're expanding the resource center to include resources that will help with accessing and navigating health insurance plans. So we just wanted to put this in here as a placeholder, and then we will be pushing that out to the community to remind everybody of where it is. And I'm going to just thank you, Dave, for that information. We also just wanted to let everyone know, so we had said at the beginning that there are a couple different levels of the engagement that we've been doing. We've been working to figure out what tools are really important and necessary to bring to the community, and again, that's largely informed by you. But then we've also been engaging on a much more systemic level in this access environment and been working to ready the space for the engagements that we'll need to have with payers, public and private, with the decision makers who really assess value for products that are coming, and to inform the frameworks that they use to make those determinations, and to ensure that clinical experts who are expert in Duchenne, that individuals who have Duchenne are part of those discussions and are at the table for those determinations and those discussions. So I just wanted to spend just a moment providing a little bit of an overview of some of the work that we've been doing in the last couple of years to ensure that PPMD and our Duchenne community were in this space already before we got to this moment. So we've been doing some work around developing what are called health economic models to support access, and I'll talk about that. Working with evaluation models. So there will be metrics assigned to say whether or not some of these products are worth it, essentially. And that takes into account, though, the value they place on improved function, the value they place on quality of life in Duchenne. And as you can imagine, we think it's critically important that value of life of someone with Duchenne, value of improved function, even if to the average person it's minimal, we think the ability to lift a glass to your mouth when you couldn't previously is incredibly important. So we've been engaged in conversations around ensuring that in those frameworks and in those algorithms for calculating value, the inputs that matter to the Duchenne community are included. We've been leading a national newborn screening program because it's been incredibly important to us that we have early access to these products, as we know that Duchenne is progressive and that the earlier we can apply these therapies, the more optimal we believe the outcome will be. And again, we were thrilled to see that there was no age restriction on the label for this first approved therapy in Duchenne. We've been engaging with the various payer programs and I think almost most importantly, supporting industry as they prepare for commercialization and community engagement, and helping to hopefully inform some of the programs that they're developing for patient and community outreach and supporting them in any way that we could. And then educating the patient assistance program. So there are now new programs being layered into the community and working with those programs individually to, again, understand our community, the needs of our community, so that you will be served optimally. And then we have our national carrier program because, again, Duchenne is not just a male disorder, and we have to have a better understanding of what it means to have Duchenne as a female or be a Duchenne carrier. We have to have solid recommendations for care for individuals, and that will also feed into labeling considerations, reimbursement considerations, guideline development, and our newborn screening efforts. So PPMD is incredibly committed to all of that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this other than to say a part of feeding into that health economic environment is PPMD partnered with our Treat NMD partners to do what's called a burden of disease study. So to help assess what the costs of living with Duchenne are before you layered in products. And you can see one of the things that was valuable about this study was, and it teases out the different countries that participated, that across the disease trajectory, costs change, and that's going to be obvious to everybody on this call, but not only because your DME costs change or because the testing you do, diagnostic testing change, or you may have hospitals and surgical interventions at different time points in the trajectory of the disease, but also there are costs that are known as indirect costs, non-medical costs. So into this calculation go, what are the costs of remodeling your home or putting a ramp on your house or having an accessible van? What are the costs for lost wages for family caregivers who are not reimbursed, et cetera? And so all of those things go into these calculations. And so that study was published in the American Academy of Neurology, and there was more data around that. And so we've also been adding some data points to SHEN Connect so that we can, again, be collecting data to help support some of these value metrics in a way that would benefit our community. We're certainly wanting to make sure that things that our community values are taken into consideration. I already spoke about early identification and newborn screening. We've been doing this from a couple of different ways. We've partnered with the American Academy of Pediatrics and created a tool for early intervention for primary care providers. And we've done this a couple of times. This one was just a year ago. And then these are just some statistics around the mean age of diagnosis is age 4, according to SHEN Connect and the National Surveillance Program for Duchenne at CDC. So we know we have to do better. And I think we had a slide missing. We also had an early intervention program called the Early, that was a partnership with CDC, and it brought together AAP, CDC, nurse practitioner programs, PA programs, to really develop an algorithm for diagnosis and outreach to primary care physicians nationally. It's a really terrific tool, a great program. It's called childmuscleweakness.org, and it has video and a lot of turnkey tools that providers can use, and patient information also on it. But all of that still didn't move the needle further beyond age 4 for a diagnosis. So we believe that, and we know that newborn screening is going to be the best way to impact early intervention and diagnosis. So We have a national newborn screening program. We are working with all of the partners in the Duchenne space who are concerned with newborn screening, including federal agencies, sister organizations. It includes a steering committee, 6 working groups dedicated to different issues in newborn screening, members of our Duchenne community. We're developing pilots that will expand on the work that was done in Ohio, where we'll implement newborn screening in real time in the states involved in those pilots, and working to really move towards a public health system where newborn screening will be offered to families at the time of birth, and then we'll be able to layer in standards of care for those newborns, especially now that we have products approved that could potentially be offered to those children. And these are our work groups for newborn screening. And then, as I said, we have our carrier initiatives. So we've been working to increase awareness among providers and to educate individuals as to that Duchenne is not just a male issue and a male concern and what it means to be a carrier. But then we have our genetic counselors on staff. We received a grant from PTC to do this education and to really, in a meaningful way, begin to look at the carrier issues and do healthcare professional education. And then we launched this summer, or I guess on Mother's Day, a program called the Female Side of Duchenne, where we are studying 300 women. It's in partnership with Nationwide Children's in Ohio to really better understand what it means to be a carrier. So it includes cardiac MRI, skeletal muscle MRIs. We're doing quality of life surveys, really looking to understand cognitive and behavioral considerations, stress biomarkers that may be involved, cardiac fibrosis, so that we know whether or not there are many women who are carriers who think that they weren't impacted, but then look back and say, you know, I did have muscle cramping, I did have this, that, and the other issue looking back, and we need to understand whether that's anecdotal or whether that's a symptom of being a carrier. And so that's what the study is really designed to do, and so that we can do some correlating also with these various biomarkers. So at our Advocacy Conference in February, many of you attend this, we always have a policy forum. This year we've decided that our policy forum in February, and that forum will be on Monday the 13th. It's specifically the policy forum, but the conference is the 12th through the 14th in Washington, D.C., will be dedicated to access. So at that time, we will have our Exondys 51 already on the market. We anticipate that if I'm counting the calendar right, hopefully we'll have a decision and an approval. We'll be hopefully optimistic around deflazacort and Marathon's product. PTC, we are very eager to see a pathway forward for PTC in the U.S. since there is a global footprint in 46 countries around the world for Adalurin. We believe there should be one here in the U.S. And so access will be an issue for many members of our community, and we think it's a really important discussion with policymakers also in February. So we invite you to mark your calendar and participate in that discussion on February 13th. And so with that, we just want to thank everybody for engaging with us, for getting us and being a part of this moment. And we encourage you to continue to let us know what information you need. And if you have an interest in being a central part of these engagements, please let us know. Please email us because we definitely need you in the conversation at the table with us. So thank you very much for joining us today, and thanks to Tim and Dave for being on this call with us.